So, hello and good afternoon, Ms. Stapleton-Simmonds. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay, great, great. It is honestly a pleasure to have you here this afternoon with the purpose of enlightening and educating the general public on this morning's proceedings in the House of Assembly. So, I'm going to ask you a few questions with respect to today's proceedings. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right, question number one. So, you were in the parliament today. Can you give us a synopsis on the mail bill that was debated?
Sure, and so the parliamentary sitting that took place in the Nevis Island Assembly was mainly to have the second and final reading of the Nevis Solid Waste Management Authority Bill 2021. And so this bill would have replaced or should repeal the Navy Solid Waste Management Authority Ordinance Cap 3.3.
All right. Okay then. So, question number two. What was your experience like?
Um, it's always a pleasure to be able to go into the House of Assembly to represent not only the Nevis Reformation Party but as well my constituents there in Nevis 5. Sometimes it can be a bit challenging because, of course, I am the lone parliamentary representative for the Nevis Reformation Party, and so it gets a bit lonely. It sometimes is
Understood.
frustrating,
Right.
but nevertheless, I am somewhat happy that I am able to do so.
Okay then. So, can you go through the pertinent sections of the bill?
Sure. So, for those of you who were following the parliamentary sitting earlier today, the introduction of the Nevis Solid Waste Management Bill would have been perhaps a follow-up. I think from my experience, it's perhaps the third solid waste bill that I have been involved in debating in the House. I'm not quite familiar with this comprehensive legislation. I think it perhaps would have had its first reading before I would have entered the Parliament. And so it's a legislation to really repeal the existing bill. And what the NIA attempted to do through the mover of the bill, who in this case was the Junior Minister of Health, the Honorable Hazel Brandy Williams, was to sort of make the solid waste management bill the governing body for solid waste management in Nevis. To what extent this bill actually gives life to the objectives or the intent of the NIA is yet to be determined. But I think that was the attempt. The bill within itself is quite comprehensive, but more so along the procedure line. So it basically outlines certain procedures as to the formation of what is coined in the bill as the authority. I think that is the governing body of the solid waste management. But quite interestingly, despite the existing bill being repealed and this new bill being introduced, the bill did not give authority for the constitution of a new body. So the existing body at present, the existing solid waste management board that continued. I'm not sure what was the main objective of that, but I take it that perhaps they did not want to introduce any new members to the board at this point in time.
And I could agree.
So one of the major components of the bill can be found in Section 5 of the bill, which deals with the Board of Authority. And the Board of Authority is really the governing body that is known as the Board of Directors that is appointed by the minister. Now, the legislation is not clear on which Minister of Health really has the authority for this bill. I'm not sure if it is the substantive minister that is the Honorable Premier or if it is the the Junior Minister of Health, but the bill, as you noticed in Parliament, was moved by the Junior Minister of Health.
Right.
So that is something that perhaps greater clarification is needed. And the board, as outlined in section 2, is to be comprised of at least 5 directors, but no more than 7 directors, including the following members. And so it's the senior representative of the Ministry of Health, the senior representative of the Environmental Health Department, and the general manager of the authority, who shall also act as secretary to the board. And so these are the 3 compulsory members that the legislation outlines that must be a part of the board. I am not certain if these persons are already members of the existing board. I take it that it is. The minister also has leeway to appoint an operational manager as well as a deputy chairperson for the authority. So, as you can see, with all of these names or functions mentioned within the legislation, I can see that we will very well exceed the 7 directors for the board. Now, it's my opinion that I know sometimes around these times when we are very close to an election, the government may try to come up with ways in terms of seeing how they could create employment and employ persons. And so one of the concerns that I have, not only as a parliamentarian, but just as a citizen, in these very tough economic times when the government have sought to put a cap on employment of persons in the public service, we have seen that despite that cap, the government has created a number of opportunities to fill very high senior positions. And so I believe that this piece of legislation creates the avenue for them to do so, because it makes the provision for the employment of a general manager as well as a operations manager. And so I'm just saying that I can see this very well coming in the near future. Now, one would have thought that because we are in a pandemic and because things are pretty hard in the shores of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, I mean, we have been talking about experiencing numerous curfews,
Yes.
lockdowns, people are out of work, unemployment is on the rise because of the fallout within the tourism sector. And so what we have noticed in recent times is that despite all of that, we have seen this government really creating opportunities, I suppose, for their political supporters to have very high and keynote positions. And what that is doing is really making the public service somewhat top heavy, therefore putting quite a strain on the public purse. And we would have seen this with the appointment of the advisor to the premier, I believe sometime earlier in the year, where despite the civil service not being stretched to see how many lay persons they can take on just to fill that gap of people experiencing the hardship, not being able to work, not being able to feed their families, and we're now talking about. So this piece of legislation gives the government the ability or the opportunity to create jobs that are very top heavy and senior positions. For example, the legislation makes provisions for the appointment of a general manager, operations manager, as well as an accountant, a secretary. And so I think one of the concerns that one may very well have, as we have seen that this government has the propensity to appoint senior positions to persons who perhaps did not work their way up the scale in the civil service. And so this has the potential to just create a lot of employment opportunities, but not necessarily for the grassroots people. For persons who can come in on a work permit, as we have seen with the appointment of the tourism officer. And so we have seen that this has been the status quo now for many, many years, and it's cause for concern, and local persons within Nevis should really be concerned about this. So it is my sincerest hope that any jobs or new positions created under this legislation would really be reserved for Nivijans and Nivijan residents alike. Now, another important section has to do with the funding of the authority, and this comes under section 10 of the legislation. And the board or the corporate body, they have the power to borrow monies, but there is a cap on that. And I would have mentioned this in the House, where the power of the authority to borrow monies over $25,000, that is EC, shall be exercisable only with prior approval of the minister in consultation with the Minister of Finance. And so it really doesn't give the board that type of flexibility that you may want to see in if we were really serious about solid waste management, and if we were deliberate in our plans. And so again, I think this legislation it's just an opportunity to really put something on the books. From reading it, I don't get the impression that the NIA is really serious about solid waste management just yet. Another section that I think the general public ought to pay specific attention to is Part 5 and Section 32. Now, this section is a new section, and it deals with the prohibition on the importation of waste. And it says that no person shall import into the island of Nevis any waste other than waste governed by the Merchant Shipping Act, Cap 705, imported under the conditions authorized by that act. Now, I'm not going to go specifically into all of the provisions, but there are some provisions that must be highlighted, and that is in Section 2, where it states that any person who imports any hazardous waste contrary to subsection 1 of this section commits an offense and shall be liable on a summary conviction to a fine not less than $650,000, but not exceeding $800,000, or imprisonment for a term of 5 years, or both. And so this section is mostly applicable to ships and aircraft and those things. Section B also states that on conviction of indictment to a fine not less than 1 million EC dollars, but not exceeding 2 million EC dollars, or imprisonment for a term of 7 years, or both, or fine and imprisonment. And so one has to ask, are these fines realistic? How can they be enforced, and actually will they ever be enforced? And so these are the questions where the legislation within itself is very cosmetic, but in terms of practical terms and really what we are trying to achieve, it begs one to wonder or to ponder if this would ever come to fruition. Yes, and so it's something really that should be taken into consideration. Another section that is of importance also has to do with the section on litter abatement. And I'm not quite sure that I fully understand or appreciate this section. And the question begs is, and I would have mentioned this in the debate in the House, how does this piece of legislation coexist with the Litter Abatement Act as well as the Public Health Act and the Environmental Health Act? It seems to me that we have a lot of pieces of legislation on the books, the law books in St. Kitts and Nevis, more specifically Nevis, that kind of doing the same thing, and we're not really seeing one, the objectives being fulfilled, and we're not seeing any sort of enforcement. And so the government is putting the legislative framework in place, and that is one way. But then the second aspect of that is really has to do with, will they enforce them? And I think Minister Eric Evelyn would have alluded to that when, during his presentation, he notified the manager of the Solid Waste Authority that he would be responsible for enforcement. And so it seems like the problem is not so much with the law, the problem has to do with the practical application and enforcement of these legislative provisions. So the Litter Abatement Act is there. It creates the provision is there for the introduction of litter wardens, and those persons would have to be obviously members of the board as well as environmental health officers. I'm not sure how this may conflict with their statutory duty and obligations under other pieces of legislation. Again, perhaps some wider consultation and discussion, yeah, it would have gone a long way. And so sometimes these are things that the government, before they introduce them, it is best to have community-wide consultation, white papers, so that people can have a discussion. I did make that suggestion in my presentation, but then of course I don't think that they fully appreciated it, because even before the first reading, this type of activity, to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief, and I could be wrong, I don't think it took place. And once you're doing anything that affects the environment, that affects the people in the masses, you really ought to go out there and educate people and have conversations and get feedback, general feedback, so that you know actually what you're putting in place, it's practical and it actually fulfills the objectives. And so I'm just going to look at that section. It's actually part 5, where it deals with waste management and license and permits. And section 21 deals specifically with the requirement for an environmental impact assessment. And subsection 1 states, for the purpose in determining the environmental impact which might arise out of any new or significantly modified construction, process, works, or other activity in respect of solid waste management facility, the authority shall designate a list of activities for which an express grant of permission from the planning authority and the environmental impact assessment is required. Now, it's not clear whether the environmental impact assessment would only be for big commercial projects, or if this has to do with any new construction or modified construction. So my concern here is whether there is need for an environmental impact assessment if you're building a simple dwelling house, not for commercial use or purposes. And so that is not really specified within the legislation, but at the same time, the legislation gives the authority significant powers in which they are able to determine what type of activities need an environmental impact assessment. For me, I think the preference would have been for the minister, both substantive or junior, the elected representative who the people voted for, to be able to make that determination and to put it in black and white in the legislation. And so we have not seen that. So you're giving this body a lot of powers. You have not defined the powers, and so that, in my view, creates an avenue where powers can be abused, and they can be used in a way that is somewhat discriminatory to certain individual or classes of people, depending on the situation. And so, again, guidance is needed as it relates to this. In my respectful view, having gone through the entire exercise in Parliament today, and even reading the legislation and trying to understand it, I do feel that it was a bit rushed. I do think that there should have been some more thought in the process. There are a lot of things in here that needed to be ironed out, and clearly, both yourself and the public would have seen that even just before the committee stage, that there were amendments made to this legislation right in the House of Parliament, which means that they didn't quite get it all together. And so, yes, it is a start, but when you're doing things like this that can have significant impact on the country and on the people, especially in these times where people are already feeling a lot of pressure, these things must be carefully planned, thought out, and executed. So, in my view, it doesn't give life to solid waste management. It doesn't create that buzz, that excitement. It's just another piece of procedural legislation that we are going to have on our books for perhaps a very long time before we can see any sort of deliberate and conscious effect of that. Another thing I wish to point out to the general public is that even though this legislation was passed in the House today, we have not seen the physical infrastructural regime being put in place in order to deal with this type of comprehensive legislation. And much to my surprise, even the mover of the bill alluded in her presentation that the existing site that we have for solid waste, that perhaps we have outgrown that, and so there is need for another facility or an expansion to the existing facility. And I was a bit taken aback by this. The mover said it, as well as the seconder, I think, the honorable member for Nevis 1,
Yes.
also made the same comment. So if it is that the government could agree and consent that better solid waste infrastructure, physical structure is needed, we have outgrown the dump site, then one would have thought that they perhaps would have looked at putting some plans in place to deal with putting an adequate infrastructure in place before we actually come to the House to debate this type of bill. And to me, I saw it as putting the, the cart before the horse. And so, again, it shows that this government is not really serious in terms of their governance, in terms of their plans, in terms of what they're putting out there. There are too many bits and pieces that are not really connecting. We need to connect the dots, and I think whenever you have an initiative or a plan, it must be done with some level of concise and deliberate purpose or effort. The objectives must be clear. And at the forefront of any plan, or any design, any piece of legislation, you have to show how would this bring benefit to the people of Nevis. I am aware that it can bring in indirect benefit in terms of improving the health conditions, because it is catered to preventative measures of people polluting and dumping waste anywhere other than the designated sites for solid waste, and it's a form of management. But at the same time, this piece of legislation could have given so much life and create so much opportunities for the people of Nevis in terms of recycling initiatives, in terms of creating green energy, in terms of using technology in order to advance solid waste management. But we're not seeing this here, and unfortunately, the debates did not surround around those avenues. So I just want to say that, again, we go into the House and we pass a bill because we can. The government is doing their legislative duty, but again, how many of us will it benefit? And I would have alluded somewhat, perhaps not directly, that I find this to be part of the continuing Napoleon approach that we have seen, where the government is more focused on taxing people, creating penalties, rather than creating opportunities for people to really advance and improve the economic welfare of the country, economic welfare and yes, and status, and to live sustainable lives, as you rightly said. But they are more focused on, this penal approach. And I think for us, going through this period of COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, where I think people are thirsty for some sort of economic relief, something that would drive the economy, something that would sustain people, something that would create jobs. We are kind of tired. I mean, this is supposed to be somewhat overrated, if I am to be brutally honest.
All right then. So, with respect to the explanation of your aforementioned concerns, do you think that um, these sections that you just educated us on, do you think that they will be put in place or implemented anytime soon?
Um, I think in terms of local waste management and the penalties for dumping
Waste.
waste illegally, that they may be enforced sooner than the others. But again, that's dependent on the whole management. I'm not sure. I see a lot of illegal dumping taking place around Nevis, but again, you don't really hear about enforcement. So I'm not sure if this would actually be able to deal with the enforcement aspect of that, because that has to be taken from a managerial and practical standpoint.
Yes.
And so it's left to be seen.
Okay, understood. So, with respect to the president of the House of Assembly, um, do you have any views? What are your concerns?
Well, I would have to be as perhaps as diplomatic as I can be. It's quite frustrating at times because sometimes the president will interject, and I don't really understand his role for interjecting. For example, as you would have seen what took place in the House this morning, where the president would have interjected when I gave the personal explanations as it relates to certain things. And so, one of the things that the president said, I think I was speaking specifically to the COVID-19 situation and the dialogue or current exchange of correspondences between the NIA and the parliamentary opposition.
Correct.
And I would have alluded to some letters that the Honorable Premier would have written to me in that capacity and my responses to him. And quite surprisingly, and I am still a bit perplexed about it, the president alluded that was not a matter for personal explanation, and I really do not see how it wasn't.
Correct.
He said it was more of a personal correspondence between myself and the Honorable Premier.
rather than a matter for the House.
Yes, and I beg to differ because the Premier, in his first correspondence to me as the parliamentary representative, and if you're writing to me in that capacity, I don't see how that could not be a matter of public interest.
Understood.
And so, in his first letter dated April 19th, and I'm just going to read the final paragraph, yes. The Premier said, I therefore write to invite your support and collaboration as member of your party in the Nevis Island Assembly and the elected representative of the people of St. Thomas's in encouraging our people to get vaccinated as quickly as possible. And so, because he was writing to me in that capacity, I do believe that that matter could have been raised as part of personal experience within the House because it not only affects myself as a parliamentary representative, but it affects the good people of St. Thomas's and by extension the people of Nevis.
Right.
And so there must be a public element in that, in that spectrum. It's not something that one would necessarily keep private between myself and the Premier, and especially because we were dealing with a public issue. We are dealing with a global pandemic, the spread of COVID-19, which is affecting the populace in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. So I do believe that it was fitting, I do believe that it was timely, and I do believe that it could have been raised, and I did raise it, and I don't think anything was wrong with it.
Okay, that's great. That was a wonderful clarification of what exactly, or may I add, the correct context of what happened. So that is it with respect to questions. Do you have any further thoughts?
I do. I perhaps, as I would have said in my presentation, I think, and this is just my personal opinion from my personal experience, I felt that the introduction of this bill, the priority that was given to it at this time, it perhaps was not the opportune time.
It was ill-timed.
Yes, I would have loved to see the focus right now going into the House today to be on really rolling out an economic plan for Nevis. All other countries in the world are rolling out their economic recovery plan as to how they are going to get their people to learn to live with COVID, how they are going to stimulate the economy. We would have seen Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, last week he gave his 5 points, learning to live with COVID plan, as I would coin it. And so the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, the Honorable Timothy Harris, he would have outlined the plan for the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, and he gave some stimulus package as to how we can get back to economic recovery and opening. And so it would have been nice for the local government here to come and perhaps do the same thing and give us something, even go to the House to increase the budget in order to interject some funds into the economy so that we can drive the economy, but nothing. The first thing on the agenda was solid waste, and we have been discussing solid waste in the House so many times before that, I am at the point where I am just sick and fed up of waste. And so I feel that the hardship that people are facing, the fact that people are hungry, people are not working, people cannot feed their children, that really should have taken priority. And I believe under NRP-led administration, after that period of lockdown, if it was our first opportunity to go into the House, we would have gone in there with a people-specific agenda as to how we are going to assist people in being able to put food on the table to provide for their children. And I am not saying that the environmental health or concerns about the environmental health, they are not pertinent. I'm simply saying that people, people being able to feed your people, being able to take people out of hardship, being able to get people working and stimulate the economy, I think that has to take precedent over everything else at this point in time. And so that is just my respectful view. Of course, people can feel free to disagree, but I would have loved to be able to participate in a debate of that nature.
Great, great. Well, honestly, that is it for my questions. It's honestly a pleasure to have you here once again, and I want to thank you for assisting and enlightening us on what was the correct context of what occurred in this morning's proceedings in the House of Assembly.
Yes, and thank you, Eliza. It's always a pleasure for me to come and to explain. And I just want to say to the good people of St. Thomas's Parish that I hear your cries. I do understand. I know a number of you have reached out to me for assistance with food packages and things of that sort. And I have been trying my best to aid those who I can, those who are in the bracket of being most needy. And yes, and so we are going to continue with the food drive initiative because I do understand that at this point in time you have to put the needs of people first. I am hoping that the government would understand that governance is a bit more than winning elections. The CCM-led administration tend to focus on winning, but not necessarily governance. And one would have seen one of the things that I am proud of to be a part and a representative of the Nevis Reformation Party for is that I believe the Nevis Reformation Party over the years have always presented leaders who ensure that when they think about planning, the planning is visionary and it is deliberate and it is catered to improving the life of all individuals, all individuals from all corners of society. We would have seen that demonstrated by our founding father, one of the founding fathers, that's the late Dr. Simeon Daniel. Yeah. And when people talk about the late Dr. Simeon Daniel, people can tell you about what he did for the country on a whole, not necessarily for them individually, but for the country in terms of moving Nevis forward in terms of economic stability. You're talking about seeing the introduction of water in people's homes as opposed to standpipes, going to the standpipe. You're talking about bringing the first hotel to Nevis, the Four Seasons Hotel. You're talking about development in the offshore sector. And so these are things that are really pioneered. And so his legacy, he is remembered for that. Now, I want people to compare that with the Honorable Van Samwick. And so, whilst he perhaps was the longest serving premier and he would have won numerous elections, for me, I don't hear people talking about his legacy in that kind of a way with excitement. Of course, he was a person that I think people liked, but in terms of bringing that type of pioneer, visionary leadership to the country and moving the country forward, you don't hear about that. If we turn the page over to Honorable Joseph Parry during that period that he would have, he was the Premier of Nevis from 2006 to 2013. There is some legendary aspect. People talk about what he did, especially in 2008 where we had the global crisis and Mr. Parry and his administration was able to keep Nevis afloat in a sense and be able to provide jobs in the civil service for people and be able to ensure that people were able to keep food on the table for their families. And so these are things that people remember. You look at the community centers that were built, you look at the roads, and so things were really done with some sort of purpose and mission. Because when you're the leader, it's one thing to win, but when you're the leader, all eyes are on you, and you have to be able to take care of all of your people. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing that from this present premier. For one, I don't even think he cares about people that much, and that was clearly demonstrated in today's House of Assembly. But I'm not seeing that type of people focused agenda. I'm not getting that kind of compassion, that passion and drive and love for people, and really aspiring to be a true visionary and a true legend. I'm not seeing that. And so that is why I say here in Nevis, we perhaps have to wake up and we have to demand more from our leaders. It's time for Nivisians to stop being so passive, because there are people out there who can lead and who can do better. And I can say here, without any shadow of doubt, I believe that if you pull any one of the NRP candidates right now and you give them a stance, just a small stance, maybe for one day, a week, in the leadership position, that they would be able to deliver and really put plans and programs in place that will cater for sustainable development of people and countries as a whole. And I can say that, without even thinking about it, because I know the backbone of the people, I know where they're coming from, I know the belly from which this type of governance was really cultured. And so it's up to the people to really give the NLP a chance, give us a chance to be able to demonstrate, the kind of leadership that I believe divisions really deserve.